Hey, Comics Cubers. Today, Alex Segura joins us to talk about writing comics and writing novels that are so different from each other, such as Archie Comics on the one hand, mystery novels on the other. Come join us.
Awesome.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Comics Cube. I'm with
Yes.
Alex Segura,
Yeah,
eh,
yeah.
who has worn many hats through comics in the last couple of decades.
Yes.
How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. We've been Facebook friends for a long time and following your work. Um, first time
I
I
appreciate your advocacy for comics.
Oh, thank you. I just love the art form so
Hmm.
much, and
Same.
that is my first question for you. It's like, why do you love the art form?
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question. I think, comics have been part of my life since I was like 4 or 5 years old. Like I remember that first Archie comic I picked up at the grocery store, Double Digest of Benny and Veronica. I vividly remember my first superhero comic. I love the power of the blending of the visual with the written word. So this, it's a very unique way to read and kind of process story. And I think it's a very unique medium. And I think too often people mistake it for a genre. They assume that all comics are superhero comics when it's actually this wide, massive medium that can contain any kind of story, memoir, sci-fi, nonfiction. Every genre can find a home in comics. So I love that potential for it. And I am an avid superhero reader, but I also try to read around that and beyond that. So um, it just never feels like you've reached the end.
No, it's like someone always tells me that these stories are like written in beach sand
Hmm.
because like every time something ends, something new begins.
Yes, true.
Did you have a particular comic that kickstarted your desire to make them or be involved in them?
Yeah, it was I joke about this. My first X-Men comic was probably the least new reader friendly comic ever. It was Uncanny X-Men 238, and I think it's the second or third part of the original Genosha story, where Wolverine is depowered in Genosha. He's partnered with Rogue, but it's not Rogue, it's Carol Danvers controlling Rogue because she's in her psyche, and it's none of the original X-Men. So any of the kind of reference points I had as a new reader were gone, and I had no idea what Genosha was. It was like it was a fill-in. It was Rick Leonardi, who's a great artist, but it wasn't Mark Silvestri. Um, but I remember being just so mesmerized, and I think that's what pulled me in. But the actual desire to make my own stories, I was doing my own kind of characters when I was reading Archie. Archie was the gateway, and then I quote unquote graduated to superhero stuff. But I remember early on, I wanted to create Archie characters, like characters drawn in like the DeCarlo style. I would draw. I was an artist. I still can draw, but I'm not like a comic book artist. But I can doodle pretty well. And back as a kid, I wanted to draw. And drawing comics was like the dream. So I would create my own Archie characters and do little stories with them, meeting the Archie cast. And then that evolved into creating my own comic books in middle school, I created this teenage X-Men ripoff, I guess, for all in retrospect, that's what it was. It's called the X Teens. That was like basically New Mutants, but it had characters that I had created and I collaborated with a friend of mine. So yeah, I think the comics that really made me want to start creating were, Spider-Man, classic Spider-Man, like John Romita era Spider-Man, X-Men, and Archie probably.
I have so many questions just coming from all of that. The
Oh, good.
first the first question that I have is, you're talking about your first comic being not new reader friendly. And of course, in recent years, there's been this whole movement to make everything, as reader friendly as possible, right?
Right.
Like putting the recaps on the front page and all of that stuff.
Mhm.
There's something to be said about being thrown right into the fire, right? As a new reader.
I think it's amazing. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people my age also had the same gateway, which was the Marvel cards, like those trading cards, the Series One, like those Impel trading cards that had all the information. So that was my tutorial into the Marvel universe and the same goes for those DC superhero cards that came out around the same time. But I found something really thrilling about being tossed into the deep end and you figure it out as you go. We didn't have not to sound all like back in my day, but we didn't have like Wikipedia or those big encyclopedia resources that we could go back to and reference and be like, what character is that? You just had to ride the wave, and hopefully my hope was always like eventually it'll be explained. Let me enjoy the journey, and there's something really liberating to that. And I think it's really a contract between the reader and the creator. You're entrusting them to tell you what you need to know when you need to know it. And it's how I approach novels, and I think how most people read novels. You just assume eventually when it matters, you're going to find out the details you need to know. And I think approaching comics in the same way was really fun. It doesn't mean I don't like stories that are not over explained, but like simplified or boiled down, so you kind of get all the basics when you come in. But there is a lot to be said for that, the insanity of just jumping into a story. Like my first Avengers comic was a Ralph Macchio issue right after Roger Stern left or was fired from the series. So it's Ralph Macchio, John Buscema, and Namor's on the team. Black Knight is on the team. It's such a hodgepodgey, weird lineup.
Marina's on
And
the team. Namor's married
yeah,
to
yeah,
her.
yeah, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It was such a bizarre lineup. I remember reading it in fourth grade and just being like, I have no idea what's going on. The characters sound a little off, but it was fun. It was beautifully drawn. It just felt like I wanted to be there. So I think that's something that I try to think about when creating comics. Like, you don't have to, and as a mystery author, you don't have to put all your cards on the table at the beginning of the game. Like, you want to have some red herrings, you want to surprise people, and you want to unfurl things at your pace. And I think I don't want to say it's lost, because I think comics maybe overcorrected, when the book market became a bigger thing and people were writing more to the trade and the direct market was pushing you more to have every issue stand alone. I mean, it was an edict dating back to the shooter days. Like, he wanted every issue to be as if it was somebody's first, but I don't think that's necessarily a guarantee that a comic's going to be successful.
No, and some people pull it off better than others, but I think you're right.
Oh, for sure.
I don't need to know right away that Rogue absorbed Carol Danvers's
Right.
personality and powers, right? I
Yeah.
do need to know in every possible story that Psylocke's psychic knife is the psychic totality.
Or if you're seeing Cannonball, he is going to tell you, I am nigh invulnerable when I'm blasting. There's just things that, or Wolverine, like, I'm the best at what I do, and what I do is not very nice. Like, these things are like touchstones. So yeah.
But it's also that repetition back then, right? Like
Hmm.
that like fixes it in your head.
Yeah,
Let's talk about Archie for a bit. You said that you
sure.
got into Archie very early on. I've got a very fanboy question for you. I ask this of every
Yeah.
Archie fan.
Hmm.
Who is the greatest Archie comics artist of all time?
Oh man. I'm so impressed. Obviously, DeCarlo is amazing. Harry Lucy is amazing. I have a really soft spot for Bob Montana's work as a whole. But I really, Dan Parent is my friend, a good friend. We've collaborated before. I do feel like he has kind of established himself as the modern look of Archie, and that's really hard to do. It's like following in the footsteps of people like DeCarlo and Harry Lucy. So my vote goes to Dan, just because I think he had the more Herculean task of like defining himself. But as a fan, as a kid, I was a DeCarlo guy. Like, I liked Harry Lucy. I love Sam Schwartz. I love, Bill Gallagher, everybody, all the classic artists. But if it was DeCarlo, I knew it was going to be great. So I know that doesn't definitively answer your question. It's kind of a wishy-washy answer, but I would say the Dans have it.
The Dans have it.
Yeah.
Yeah, like even me, my personal favorite is Harry Lucy, but I was like, no, it's DeCarlo. That's the only objective answer.
Yeah, I mean, I love Harry Lucy, and I love Sam Schwartz's Jughead. I love and I love Pat and Tim Kennedy, who passed away recently. But the Kennedy
Oh, sorry.
brothers are
That's it.
probably the most evocative or closest to that Lucy style in the modern day, with the Sam Schwartz kind of dynamic slapstick. But yeah, DeCarlo he never drew a bad panel.
No. And how did you feel when you got the job for Archie Comics? Vice President of Publicity and Marketing in December 2010. I'm on your LinkedIn.
Um, Yeah, oh good. Yeah, I hope it's up to date. I hope it's accurate. I think, I had a long time back and forth with Archie. I did freelance for Archie before I moved to New York to work at DC in 2006. So I knew the people there, like Mike Pellerito, who's still the co-president. And when I left DC to go to Archie, I think some people were like, well, why would you want to leave DC, Batman and Superman, and you have these iconic characters. But to me, Archie and his friends were just as iconic. Like I grew up on those characters, and they felt like so much a part of Americana and pop culture. Um, so I really saw it as my mandate, in partnership with John Goldwater, who had just stepped in as CEO, and Mike and the whole team. It was to really like bring the spotlight back to those characters because they are so widely beloved. And I think that was validated over the last, well, now it's been like almost, yeah, a decade or so.
Yeah, I think that when I talk to fans and whatnot,
Hmm.
we tend to think that working for DC, working for Marvel is like the pinnacle of working for comics. But
I
there's
mean,
a
it was cool for sure. Yeah,
yeah,
it was definitely amazing. But yes, you're sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
but I mean, like much like any other job, there's got to be like other considerations, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was. I think it was a time in my career I wanted to, just move up. You wanted to climb up, the professional ladder and do more and do, kind of just explore, expand my skill set. And so it was interesting to go from a very big corporation comic book company to something a family-owned comic book company. It was a much smaller operation. Um, and there wasn't the rules that you would have at a bigger company. So, there's pros and cons in either way. And I love the characters. So, and I knew the history, and I knew what would make them interesting to readers. I thought I did. And so, yeah, it was a blast. I mean, and then I went back to DC briefly, but then I came back to Archie again, and I was there for a long stretch. And yeah, I'll always consider them friends, and it was a good time.
Who's your favorite Archie character to write?
I love Jughead. I have a soft spot for Sabrina. I really love Betty. I mean, I like them all for different reasons. I think the only character maybe I didn't gel with was Reggie, but that's kind of as a writer, you lean into the weakness, you lean into the thing that you maybe are worried about and make yourself do it. So, when I was writing the Archies with Matt Rosenberg, he would do a lot of the Reggie stuff. I think he found Reggie more sympathetic than I did, and I would lean into like the bigger picture Archie B and V stuff, but not defaulting to the love triangle.
Yeah, the first time I read your work was the Archies,
Oh, thanks.
which is part of the new look, the
Hmm.
new look Archies. And the thing that struck me about it, not to spoil an old story,
Yeah.
is that you didn't give it a happy ending.
No.
And I think I was surprised at that. Like, I
Good.
think despite the new look, I think I still expected Archie to have, you know, a hopeful, happy ending. And what was your approach to writing that particular series and giving it that particular tone?
Yeah, no, thank you for pointing that out. I think it's Matt Rosenberg and I still talk about it when we chat. It's a book about failure. It's a book about having a goal and setting out and trying your best and failing, but then learning the lesson that, not to get all lovey-dovey about it, it's about the journey, but it's also about the friends you made along the way. It's more about their dynamic and their friendship and what they mean to each other. Like the last scene of the book is very much that. Like no one else is watching them. They're just playing a show for themselves and the people cleaning up the bar, which happened to be me, Matt, and Matt Herms and Joe Eisma, like drawn into the issue. But yeah, it's a story about like, you have sometimes you fail and you probably learn more from failure than success. So
Is that taken from real life?
yeah, I mean, I think if you're not learning from your mistakes, you're bound to make them again. But and not everything is a home run. Not to just keep rattling off cliches, but um, I'm the kind of writer that I learn by repetition. If I do something and it doesn't work, then I try to absorb how other people do it and do it differently the next time. But if you're never perfect out of the gate, I certainly wasn't.
How what was it like being there and writing for the new look Archie? Because that was pretty controversial at the time, from what I remember.
Um, I think it was interesting because I was editing the Dark Circle books. I was also overseeing communications and marketing, and I always wanted to write. So that was kind of one of the appealing things of coming to Archie in the first place is that they were open to me writing like a few digest stories or like classic stories. But the Archies was my first. I hate to call it New Look because New Look was something that happened before. There was a New Look, Archie New Look in the 90s. But the Wade Staples-esque Archie, I hadn't really worked on it until the Archies. It was fun. it was much more YA. It was less about the slapstick, and it was less. The thing I loved about Archie as a kid was that you're watching a sitcom. You know, there's no continuity. There's a great book by Bart Beatty called The 10 Cent Archie, and it's about he read the entire era of Archie when it was 10 cents, and he comes up with some really savvy thoughts. You know, there's no continuity, but there is consistency. You know, Jughead's going to want to eat a burger. You know, Archie is going to do this, or Veronica's going to do that, and it was different with the more modern Archie because there was some continuity. I mean, I could do something that maybe contradicted what was happening in the main Archie book, and nobody would really care because it wasn't like the X-Men, but now there was a continuing narrative. From one issue to the next, the story would continue. So it was a different approach to an Archie story. But I found that really interesting. And we brought a much more like YA dynamic to the Archies. And I love music. I'm a huge music fan. Matt is as well. And so is Joe Eisma, the artist. So we really poured our various experiences in bands or touring with bands or just being music fans into that comic. And then having the added wrinkle of real cameos in the book was really a fun wild card because we'd done all those one shots. We did Archie Kiss, and then Matt and I with Giselle did Archie Meets Ramones, and so it was a nice kind of build off that. And it was fun. It was one of my favorite creative experiences.
Yeah, as a music fan, how did you feel writing those crossovers?
It was daunting. I mean, it was daunting even if you love the band like Blondie. I grew up listening to Blondie. If it was a band that I wasn't super familiar with, I would you'd have to do your research. So there was some stress, but the challenge was how do we weave it into the narrative of this issue? And then how do we weave that issue into what's coming into the next one? Like you have the big overarching idea, like this is what the big story is going to be. So what are the pit stops along the way? And then how do you throw in Churches? How do you throw in the Monkees? How do you throw in, Tegan and Sarah? How do you throw in all these bands? And it was like putting a puzzle together. Very much, writing a comic script is like putting a puzzle together in many ways. It's different from prose where you're just kind of dumping the words onto the page and editing later, but it was fun. I mean, I thought Matt was a great collaborator. Joe is an amazing artist, super underrated. I think he deserves much more credit than he gets. And we had Matt Herms on colors and the legendary Jack Morelli on letters. So it was a good team.
You also did, the actual crossovers, which is, as you mentioned, Archie Meets the Ramones.
Yeah.
Archie Meets Kiss. Did you ever feel that, how do I put this? Like, did you ever feel that like you were writing a time capsule for fans of for fans of those bands? Or were you trying to still write it for the younger modern Archie audience?
That's a good question. I think it was a little bit of both. You strike the balance. Like with Kiss, there's a very ardent fandom. Like people just love that band. They love the mythology surrounding the band. You could say the same for the Ramones, actually. So it was a little bit of not appeasing, but entertaining that audience, like the new readers that are coming in that are Ramones or Kiss fans and looking to have that kind of played to. But then you need it to be a funny Archie story. It has to feel like an entertaining story. And with Kiss in particular, we wanted to make it feel like an event. Like, Sabrina and Josie, at least when I was reading, hardly ever appeared in the Archie stuff. So you would have Archie, you have Sabrina, you'd have Josie, you'd have little Jinx, the Wilkins boy. So having them all interact and then having Kiss show up just made it feel like a big moment. So yeah, I think it was a little bit of both. How do you make it entertaining for the fan that isn't an Archie reader that's coming in because they love this band? And how do you make it just a fun Archie story? So part of that with Kiss was making them into actual like comic book characters, like superpowered beings. And the Ramones, the twist was you have to have them time travel back to see like the peak Ramones.
Yeah. My last question about Archie is that, most Archie comics I find like tend to be more than Marvel and DC, more than a lot of other comics. They tend to like talk about the current events more blatantly, right? So like, for example, like Occupy Riverdale.
Yeah.
Did you ever feel that like working on Archie comics was going to instantly date itself?
No, I think
because sometimes I'm reading the older Archie comics and I'm like, they have BB radios, which I love because I learned stuff that I didn't know about.
Yeah. No, I think you always one of the things John Goldwater always said is that I don't want Archie to feel like it's trapped in the past. I want people to read Archie and realize it's happening today. And that doesn't mean that he's reading a headline and it's today's headline. It just means that the world doesn't feel like it's Pleasantville. You know, it doesn't feel retro. It feels modern, and it reflects the diversity of the world. You know, and I think that was a big step that the company took under his watch. And so with something like Occupy Riverdale, obviously the Occupy Wall Street thing was happening, and it was a big news. And it just was a springboard, and we'd have these editorial meetings and kind of bounce ideas back and forth. And that was the fun of Archie, and I'm sure it's still the same, is that an idea would pop up and it could happen. It could get slotted into like the next issue, because the comics didn't have that serialized narrative yet. It was still before, I'm not saying that one's better than the other, but it was before like the new Archie #1, so you could just slot in a story and you had that flexibility, and that was really fun.
For our younger viewers, Pleasantville is not a figure of speech. That is a
Yeah,
movie. Go look it up.
yes. Google it.
I think that when you left Archie, the thing that really surprised me was this pivot that you did.
Mhm.
Because I had associated your name with Archie so much that I didn't think that you would do noir and crime. Like, you have a
Yeah.
comic called The Dusk with David
Mhm.
Hahn,
Yeah,
who I love.
he's great.
He's great. What was so? It is very clear that this is where your passions lie. Like, what is it about this specific genre or subgenre, shall we say, that
Mhm.
that draws you in so much?
Yeah, I think there was like a stark contrast for a long time where I was, Archie was my day job and I was working creatively at Archie, but also writing these like dark and gritty PI novels set in Miami, and also writing comics like The Black Ghost and then eventually other stuff. But I'm always fascinated by the dark corners of story. Like noir to me is one of my favorite genres. This idea that it's, people are pushed to the brink and what do they do? Like that's a noir story. Like what happens when you make a mistake and you have to desperately cover it up to kind of maintain your life? And that's really like the root of noir, film noir, murder mysteries. Those things always fascinate me. Like exploring the darker corners of characters, whether they're quote unquote good people or bad, it's always really interesting. And I started reading a lot more mysteries when I moved to New York, um, from Miami to work in DC, and then you work in comics and comics becomes your job. So I started creatively thinking about novels as like a way to express myself. And that's when I started writing the Pete Fernandez novels. And eventually I got to a point where I could write comics for other places. And that's where things like The Black Ghost and eventually more series like that came up. So
So, I asked you earlier, like, what were your influences when it comes to writing? But what are your influences specifically when it comes to noir and crime?
oh wow, that's a great question. My favorite crime writers are, my Mount Rushmore is probably like George Pelicanos, who wrote for The Wire, the TV show, but he also wrote the Nick Stefanos books. Dennis Lehane, who did, Mystic Rivers, probably his most famous, but he wrote the Pat and Angie PI series. Laura Lippman, who had a great PI series starring this woman reporter named Tess Monahan. Walter Mosley, James Elroy, Michael Connolly. Those are like the greats that I just go back to sometimes. When I don't really believe in writer's block, but there are moments when you're stuck and you're just kind of, you need that jolt of inspiration. And the best solution for any kind of block in that way is to just read something you love. You read something you love and you get re-energized. You're reminded like why you do this. Megan Abbott is also a huge influence, like just one of those touchstone writers that you don't try to copy them, but you definitely think about them while you're writing. Like what would they do? Greg Rucka is a huge influence in both comics and prose. Like I think he writes really powerful characters and is very smart at how he explores like the gray areas of characters. Like they're not good people and they're not bad people. They're complicated people, and sometimes complicated people do bad things, and that's interesting to me.
I love Greg.
Yeah, just a great guy, like a great, mentor and friend. So
Uh, so when it comes to noir, I mean, I noticed Greg is the only guy that you named in comics. From is
mhm.
that and you do write a lot of novels in that
Yeah.
genre, but not a lot of comics in that genre. Is it more difficult to do mysteries in comics?
I would say that in terms of comics, there are a lot of great crime writers. Like Ed Brubaker is fantastic. I really love his stuff. Yeah, I love David Lapham. Straight Bullets is amazing. 100 Bullets is a great crime series. There's so many. Like I just feel like I'm shortchanging somebody. But um, what I do usually with my comics is that since I'm doing like the straight crime stuff as a novel, I usually kind of filter the noir stuff through other tropes or other prisms, and like the Black Ghost is a PI story, except she's a superhero. She's not a private eye, she's a superhero, but it's got all the elements of a PI story. Something like The Awakened, which is a comic I do with Mike Moreci and Dean Kotz on Zest World. It's a murder mystery, but it's the backdrop is a Avengers or JSA or JLA type team called the Freedom Alliance. And even the Dusk is me trying to tell like an all ages Batman type story that I can hand to my son and say, read this, and I'm not worried about it, but it still kind of evokes the wonder that I had when I was reading those stories. Um, so I wouldn't say I don't do noir. I would say one of the great things about noir is that it's super flexible. Like you can read a novel about cheerleading and it can be noir. You can read a
Yeah,
novel about science and it's noir. Secret Identity is about comic books, but it's a noir story. And I think that's very flexible. And you can do it with any of the superhero tropes, which I find fascinating because I mean I love superheroes. Like I think there's no, I don't believe in guilty pleasures. Like I think you like what you like and
absolutely.
embrace that. And I love superhero stories. I can also love, Love and Rockets is probably my favorite comic of all time. Like it's
Really.
just yeah, just such an epic story. Like especially the Jaime. I mean, I love Beto stuff, but the Jaime stuff is really what spoke to me as a new reader. And just the idea that the characters age, that they're drawn in this, it's very like punk rock Archie and how it's
Yeah.
drawn, like the visual style, but the stuff they cover, the things they deal with, the trauma that the characters experience over generations is really just, there's nothing else like it.
That both surprises me that that's your favorite comic and doesn't surprise me at the same time.
Okay. Well, and it's also
Because
just on a representation level, like just seeing other Latin characters in starring roles as opposed to being like comic relief or like the villains. It was really refreshing.
yeah, so you write the Pete Fernandez novels, right? And
Hmm.
like I think going into fandom, I think there's a preconception, which may be a misconception, that that people are mandated to write minority characters,
Right.
mandated to show representation, mandated to show diversity. Is that the case, or are you just trying to draw from life?
There is no mandate, and if there is, I have not gotten my letter in the mail. No, I mean, I wanted to reflect the world that we live in. I wanted to read it. I wrote the story I wanted to read. And that's
Mhm.
the best point to start a story is it's something you want to read that only you can write that doesn't exist yet. And as a reader, a lot of the PI novels I read were about grizzled ex-cops with drinking problems, that were white men. And I think that's fine. There's some great ones like Philip Marlowe and, Lou Archer and obviously Spencer, and there's many, many, many of them. But I wanted to read a story about someone like me, like someone in at the time, like in their early 30s, who was, you know, my age. I always joke that Pete was someone could have gone to college with, like someone that had the same Cuban American background, was from Miami, like knew the streets of Miami really well, and I wanted that. And so you kind of will that into existence. That said, had I written outside of my own experience, I think that's okay too, as long as you do the homework and you do the work and you understand why you're doing it. I think especially in mystery circles and prose circles, there's a lot of blowback. Like, well, I should be able to write whatever I want, and no one is saying you can't. You can write whatever you want, but just have a good reason for why you're doing that, and also do the work. Like, authenticity readers are amazing. Research is obviously a huge thing. I think a lot of people just don't want to be called on their work. They want to be able to have the free pass without any, paying for the ticket, I guess.
Yeah.
But there's a nuance to it and there has to be a reason for it. Like if I'm going to write outside of my experience, I should have a reason why. And um and I should also not assume that because I'm writing it, I'm going to take a stab at writing the definitive experience for that marginalized group, because it's not really my place to do that.
No, I get it. Like
Yeah.
there were Filipino characters in a mainstream superhero comic a while back, and only thing I could see was like, wow, the team on this has definitely never been to the Philippines.
Yeah,
It's the
yeah.
only thing. And then Wave showed up in Agents of Atlas like a few years
Mhm.
later, and I was like, oh, put Wave in everything.
Yeah. No, and I remember as a kid, you'd read a comic and they'd have Spanish, and you knew that nobody checked the Spanish. Like it was just someone's idea of what Spanish sounded like. And that stuff just it happens, but it's happening less, which is good because I think there's a push to make sure that, people are speaking to their speaking true to their voice. They're getting the opportunity to represent their communities and their groups through their fiction and their work, which I think is great. It doesn't mean you can't write outside of your experience because that would be super limiting. But
Yeah.
I also think it's okay to have the readers call you out if they don't think you did something right. And if you didn't do it right, you know, just fix it next time. Try better, do better next time.
Something like the Poe Dameron novels.
Mhm.
Were you approached for that, or did you pitch for that?
They reached out to me. It was right around the time I finished up the Pete series, which was funny when I announced that Miami Midnight was going to be the last one. I got the biggest uptick in like response to the whole series. I mean, people liked the series. It was nominated for awards. It did pretty well, but everyone kind of assumed I guess it was a good time to go out because everyone kind of assumed like, oh, this is going to go on forever. He's going to write a book a year and we'll have like 20 Pete Fernandez novels. But I really wanted to do something else. I felt like Pete's arc had ended. And so the response was really huge and they were upset. They were like, how could you end this? Like, we just got started. And that was actually really flattering. But I had just ended the series and Lucasfilm reached out and they said, we want to do Poe Dameron's origin story. And this was in the lead up to the last of the new trilogy films, where you find out Poe was a spice runner. You get a little hint at his relationship with Kerry Russell's character Zori Bliss. Um, but the thing is, it's like 5 seconds on the screen. Like they have the exchange. You see Zori, like I think she's on screen 10 minutes and she's always in her helmet. You don't really know her backstory. So there was a lot of fertile ground to cover with that book. And it was also really exciting to add to the canon. Like Star Wars, I'm a huge Star Wars fan, and it was wild to be able to, just carve out a little piece of the mythos. And then to build on it. Like I did a one shot for Marvel recently, Return of the Jedi Rebellion, where it served as kind of a soft prequel to the Poe Dameron stuff.
When you're writing a novel and when you're writing a comic, what are the differences between the two approaches?
The level of collaboration. I mean, with a novel, there is collaboration. Your editor is going to give you notes. Your agent theoretically might give you notes. You're going to have to adhere to whatever the publisher wants to some degree, unless you're self-publishing and in complete control. But all that collaboration happens at the end. You turn in the draft. The book is done. You've done a novel. You've written 300 odd pages of work, and that's all kind of established in your brain. With a comic, you're writing to the next person down the line. I wish I knew who to credit for the saying, but you're writing to entertain the next person down the line. You write to impress your editor, and then you're writing to impress the artist, so the artist gets excited to draw it, and then they're drawing to excite the colorist, so they get excited to color it, and then at the end of the line is the editor. And the hope is that by exciting all those people, you've created something that will be exciting or interesting to the reader. But what I love about comics and what keeps me doing comics is that the end result is never what I envisioned at first. Like what I visualize as I'm writing is doesn't translate exactly on the page. And it's kind of that alchemy of like my words plus the person's art becomes something wholly new. It's the closest thing I can connect it to is like being in a band. Like you strum your guitar part, somebody adds the bass part, and you're like, oh, that was not what I expected, but it sounds really cool. And with prose, you're completely in control. You're the director, you're the script writer, you're the costume designer, you're the cinematographer, you're the editor. In comics, a lot of that falls on the artist, and I think artists still don't get enough credit. It's in terms of being co-creators or being like involved in the creative process, but they're doing all the visual heavy lifting. You're teeing them up, which is really exciting. But you're the screenwriter there. If we're continuing to use the movie metaphor.
And what are the differences there between doing a comic for, let's say, Marvel or DC or even Archie, versus a self-published kickstarted one like the Dusk?
Yeah. I mean, I think the big difference is again, this is something I've heard over the years is you get to play with the toys in work for hire. You play with the toys, you're in the sandbox, but you don't want to break them and leave. You want to keep them in good enough shape that the next person can play with them and have enough of a good as much of a good time as you did. Whereas with something like the Black Ghost or the Awakened or the Dusk or any creator-owned story, if I want to break the toys, they're my toys to break. And if I feel like that's what serves the narrative, then I can do that. There's no limit, which doesn't mean I will do that, but you have that freedom. Whereas with Marvel or DC or any other work for hire, like you're part of a long chain of people that are working on these characters, and you're adding to a long running story. So you have to be more judicious about that, and you're probably given more editorial kind of runway. Like this is the kind of story we want, or this is the length, and this is what the beats we want to hit. And I think with Poe Dameron, all they said is we want to tell his origin story. We want it to involve the Spice Runners, and we think it could involve Zori Bliss and throw in Babu Frick. So that was like what I got to start. And then I did the outline and you go back and forth. So it's more collaborative with an editorial entity, I would say. Whereas with creator owned, you bring in an editor and they help you. They help you make a better comic. But at the end of the day, it's your character. So they can't really say, well, so and so wouldn't do that. And you're like, well, they would because I created them, so it's not to be glib about it, but that's the difference.
Is it harder to get started on something creator owned specifically because there's no specific brief?
It is harder because you don't have the support system of a publisher out of the gate. Like when you get an assignment from an established company and they say we want you to write a story featuring X character, it'll be 12 pages in this issue. You've got the safety net. Everything's set up for you. They're going to find an artist. They're going to find everyone, and you just need to focus on the writing. With creator owned, I have to think about, well, who do I want to collaborate with? Like with the Dusk, I love David's style. I love his it felt very evocative of Batman the Animated Series, but not like he was aping it. Like I knew he could do something that felt like in that wheelhouse. And so there's a lot of prep work. You brainstorm, you create the designs, you create the pitch. So there's a lot of world building. And you think thematically, whereas with work for hire, you're handed the baton. Like the world exists already. You're not creating the Daily Bugle, you're not creating Peter Parker's supporting cast. You're just in there, and you are brought in to write your story, like as it fits into this pre-existing mythos. Whereas with creator owned, you have to start from zero, which is fun. I love it. I really think it's cool, and it lets me play with archetypes that I like. Like the Black Ghost is very much a love letter to Daredevil or characters like that, like street level superheroes blended with like PI novels, like the flawed private eye struggling to succeed. And the Dusk is playing with the Batman archetype in some ways. So that's where creator owned lets you do what you want to do in ways that you probably wouldn't get to do with those characters,
And my last question about the Dusk is that you mentioned earlier that this was your attempt to do a family-friendly Batman story.
Yeah.
Do you think that's missing from today?
No, I mean, I read the Scooby-Doo Batman mysteries with my son. They're written by some friends of mine. Ivan Cohen is a longtime friend, and he does a great job. I think there are all ages Batman stories. We read the Batman animated comics, but I really, at the time, I think he was 5, and I wanted him to read something that wasn't like overly violent. I think the main Batman titles, they're crime stories. So there's going to be some violence. There's going to be some gunplay. So I wanted him to kind of connect with those kind of stories, but not yet get him into like the mainstream stuff.
Okay, let's talk about Secret Identity.
Okay, I'm ready.
Secret Identity. This is a book that came out last year. It's won a bunch of awards at this point. For those not in the know, can you give us a quick elevator pitch of what this novel is about?
Yes. So Secret Identity is the story of Carmen Valdez, who's a queer Cuban-American woman. She moves from Miami to New York in 1975 to work in comics, which is her dream. You find out that she grew up reading comics. She learned how to read English from comics. Her parents came over from Cuba, and it was a very kind of major touchstone for her and her dad, going to the newsstand each week to pick up comics. She gets a job at this third-rate publisher. Like if Marvel and DC are A and B, Triumph Comics is D or E. as the executive assistant to Jeffrey Carlisle, who's the publisher and founder of the company. And Carmen does it because she wants to write comics. That's her dream. And so she's pitching him stories, pitching him ideas until he finally tells her it's not going to happen. Okay, look, just stop asking me. I've got friends I've got to keep fed. I've got freelancers I need to keep entertained. Like someday, maybe you'll be an editor or something. But for now, just like be my secretary. Don't pitch me any more comics. So she's obviously heartbroken and despondent. She goes back to her apartment and she is surprised to meet Harvey Stern, who's a colleague at Triumph, about her age. And he tells her that he's gotten an assignment to launch a new female superhero for the Triumph superhero line. Um, but he has no idea what to do. He wants to do it. He knows Carmen writes stories. He knows that she's been pitching Jeffrey. He knows that she loves superheroes. And the only catch is if they do this together, she can't be credited. And so, that's the big fork in the road that gets the book moving. Like, if your dream is presented to you with this caveat, like that you have to do it anonymously, would you still do it? And I think most people probably would. And so Carmen does. Um, they turn in the first arc of scripts, or the first 6 issues of scripts, after like a feverish writing session. And the following week, she sees the scripts have been turned in under Harvey's name, which she knew was happening, but was still very jarring to her to see, like, oh God, this is happening. Like, this book is going to happen without me. And then she discovers that Harvey's been murdered. So the only person on the planet that knows Carmen has had any role in the creation of this character, who's called the Legendary Lynx, who's a very Moon Knight, Daredevil, the Cat, Spider Woman type character. She protects the streets of Triumph City. She works at the Daily Triumph newspaper in her secret identity. And so Carmen basically has to solve the murder of her friend to reclaim this character. And at the same time, as you're reading the prose, like the novel, you're seeing pages drawn by Sandy Jarrell, who's amazing, of that comic book. So you're reading Secret Identity, the novel, and then you're hopping into the Legendary Lynx comic book and getting little vignettes of what Carmen has been creating. So
What led to the creation of this novel?
So I first started thinking about it right around the time the Poe Dameron book was happening. I knew I wanted to write a crime novel that was not tied into a series. I wanted to do a standalone, which is funny because now it's not a standalone. There's going to be another novel in that world, but I wanted to write a story about a murder mystery in comics. I didn't know what it was. I knew I wanted it to be in a different time. I wanted it to be not in the present day. I wanted to evoke an era that's lost, like that doesn't exist anymore. So a lot of the inspiration dates back to almost my college days. Like I remember reading Cavalier and Clay and loving it and feeling very much like, wow, there's finally a novel about comics, like, this world that I love. But the one thing that I kept wondering about is like, I really wish I could see the Escapist comics. Like I'm reading all about this character and all this amazing world and hearing about how this guy draws and what the comics look like, but I want to see them. And eventually, I think Dark Horse did do that eventually as a prestige add-on, but I wanted them in the novel. And I never thought like, oh, eventually I'll do that. It was just something I filed away. And around the same time, in a creative writing class in college, I was writing a short story about this comic book company employee that discovers this lost superhero. So all that stuff was just in the back of my mind. And I had created a character called the Lynx when I was out of college before I moved to New York. So that was in my back pocket somewhere too. So all these things, no idea ever really goes to waste. Like you just kind of file it away and hope that you can pull it out at some point. But I think what really clicked for me was I had that table was set, but I didn't know who the character was. And I was reading this book called The 10-Cent Plague by David Hadju,
Yeah.
which talks about, the crackdown on comics in the 50s, congressional crackdown that led to the creation of the Comics Code and basically the dissolution of EC Comics and a lot of other smaller publishers. But one of the people he interviews early on in the book is a woman that worked in comics at that time before the purge. And he asked her, well, why didn't you come back? And she said, there was no job for me when I come back. I'm like a forgotten part of comic book history. I'm probably not, I'm not quoting it directly, but that I remember that, oh, wow moment as I was reading that. And that's when Carmen appeared to me. And I knew that this book had to happen in the 70s, which is a very interesting time in comics because it's right before the direct market really ramps up. It's before like Comic Cons really ramp up. There were little things. There were some comic shops. There were some, like hotel lobby comic conventions, but comics were not a huge part of pop culture yet. I mean, sure, there had been the Batman TV show, there had been other little things, but it wasn't like today where you have stuff like an Ant-Man show, an Ant-Man movie, or a Moon
Yeah.
Knight show, like characters that probably when you and I were reading comics as kids, we never thought. I never thought there would be a Moon Knight TV show. Like, I just thought Moon Knight was like a C-list character. Like, he looked cool and I liked him, but nobody outside of the comic world knew who he was. But now you hear people talking about like, oh, did you see WandaVision? And it's like wild. But in the 70s, 1975, that was just seemed like a different universe. And so I wanted to flip it and have it set in this time where if you're reading it now and comics are everywhere, you're like, oh, there was a time when comics were not everywhere. And I wanted to play a little bit with the idea of character creation and character ownership. And, it's a murder mystery through the prism of like IP, basically.
There are
Excuse me.
so many comic book adaptations now that I finally feel no need to see all of them.
Yeah. I mean, also, if you've read the comics, like, I'm not saying you don't have to, but, you watch the stuff you like. So,
Exactly. Like I'm like, okay, Blue Beetle's
yeah.
out. Okay, I'll watch it
Yeah.
eventually.
Yeah.
Um, so the 1970s, I was gonna ask why that time, and you just explained why, but because I do think
Hmm.
that's a very interesting time for comics because the Marvel Age
And for New York.
and for New York, right? That was
Yeah.
before the big cleanup of New. It was way before the big cleanup of New York.
Yeah, before like the Disneyfication of Times Square, where it's like you're in a mall instead of like an episode of The Deuce, like it's just a very different world. And I think that contrast is really interesting. So that was fun to play with. And one of the things that I thought going in that was not smart is, oh, I thought, okay, I know comics, I know comic book history, it'll be fine, I'll just write it. But it became a very journalistic endeavor in terms of like people I interviewed, books I had to read or reread. A lot of people were helpful in that journey, like a lot of creators that worked in the 70s, or a lot of women that worked in comics in the 70s or worked in comics period. A lot of creators that worked around that time that could give some context and just color. Like, you want it to feel like it's happening in that moment. Like, you don't want it to feel like, oh, he clearly researched this and this is something he found on Wikipedia. You want the texture and the feeling of verisimilitude that this could have happened. And my favorite thing is when people email me and ask about the links and they say, I can't find this book anywhere. I can't find, I've done research and I can't find it anywhere in my price guide. And that to me is a sign of success, that people read the book and thought, okay, he must be basing this off some kind of true story, which is flattering.
When you're writing historical fiction, how
Yeah.
do you how do you know which liberties to take with actual history?
Um, yeah, that's a great question. I think you know, I wanted to like I love James Ellroy's historical fiction. I love stuff like the Black Dahlia and the LA Quartet and the American Underground trilogy, things that weave into like major historical figures like J. Edgar Hoover, Nixon, the Kennedys. They're all woven in there in some way. I think the trick is you can't have real people acting outside of their defined life. Like there's a moment in Secret Identity where Carmen rattles off the people that are at a Comic Con. Or she'll say, oh, there's Len Wein, or there's like, I heard Jack Kirby and Walter Gibson are doing a panel. All that is based in fact. So she's weaving through the reality of established fact. And that's the challenge with historical fiction, especially if you're dealing with real people. And um, yeah, and I think the other challenge is to just make sure you're mindful of anachronisms. You don't want her like then suddenly pulling out her cell phone to take a picture, like things that you wouldn't have to think about if you're writing a story in the present day, but you have to
Yeah.
be really mindful. Like a friend of mine caught this in the galley stage. She told me, she was like, DNA wasn't a thing in the 70s. So she wouldn't say like it's in my DNA, because it wasn't like, things like that. And one thing I was really interested in was the process of making comics. Like what inks did they use? Like what was the commerce of making the comic? Like, a courier would send the inked pages to the letterer who everyone lived in New York. A lot of people lived in the Upper East Side. So it was a much more insular industry than it is today, where it's global. Like I could send my script to an artist in Argentina and then he can upload them to an FTP, and, a colorist in another part of the world is going to do their part. And it's just amazing. It's a global thing. Whereas back then it was very inside baseball.
when so because that was also my question when I was reading Cavalier and Clay, right? It was like
Yeah.
talking about how great Joe Cavalier was an artist and everything. And the comic book part of me couldn't turn off like what Will Eisner isn't the greatest comics artist of the
Right.
golden age in this
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
That's impossible, as much as I love Cavalier and Clay.
Yeah.
But so with things like that, I guess my question is, do you have them? You said not acting outside of their defined life. What
Mhm.
if, for example, it's somebody who has a legend surrounding that person? Are you going to write around that person's legend? Like, let's say Stanley
Mhm.
or Jack Kirby. Um, are you going to write around that person's legend or around what you know of that person's life? Like,
I think you have to. I would default to the facts. Like, what can I weave through? It's all about finding the little spaces where your characters can breathe. So in my mind, Triumph was a comic book company that could have existed in that era, and it was very similar to companies like Charlton or Warren or Quality or Atlas, like that filled the bottom of the top 10, I guess, if you're doing the top 10 publishers. And then what are the factual things that you can weave your characters through? Like there's the legendary poker games that would happen between the editors at DC and Marvel. And so I thought, wouldn't it be cool if like Jeffrey Carlisle was at one of those games and Harvey was at one of those games? And so that's part of the story. Or the volleyball games in Central Park between Marvel and DC and other companies. I thought, well, Triumph would be there. So like weaving your characters into places where historical stuff has happened, and that's the verisimilitude, like the feeling that this fictional thing is weaving into established history, which is different from what there's that the short story that Alan Moore wrote in his Illuminations book where everyone
yeah.
is represents somebody else. Like you spend so much time trying, this is not a criticism, but you're spending so much time trying to figure out like, oh, does he mean this person is that person? And Thunderman is obviously Superman, but I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to create allegories. I wanted my story to exist in the real world where there was Superman and Batman and the X-Men, not the X-Men, well, the X-Men, the original X-Men, but Spider-Man and things like that. I wanted it to feel like it had actually happened.
Yeah, Thunderman is barely fictional. Like
It's dark. It's definitely a dark story.
in Secret Identity, I think one of the things that also, like, going back to my Will Eisner thing, that also
Mhm.
makes it easier to buy into is that you do not make Triumph Comics one of the biggest comics companies. I feel like
Right.
if you did make it like number one or two, the reader would constantly be going, really? Above
Yeah.
DC?
It's got to feel like it could have happened. And if I had gone in there and been like Triumph like is outselling DC and this book is outselling Doom Patrol or what have you, like even the most casual comic fan would be like this is not accurate. Like and that pulls you out of it. And I didn't want to pull people out of it. I wanted them to feel like, oh, this could have happened and now I'm into it and I'm really like engaged with these characters and I want to see what happens as opposed to the fantasy baseball of it where you're like, is who's this supposed to be and how does this fit into actual history?
What makes prose the right medium for Secret Identity?
Um, hmm. Well, I have a little bit of a cop out because it's not all in prose, but I think the core novel itself, it was just such a personal vision, and I had such a very clear idea of what I wanted it to be in terms of tone and feel and style that it just didn't feel like a comic book. The Lynx stuff did feel like a comic book, and even that stuff is very meta because Sandy is evoking the style of the era. Like he's not drawing it like he would draw an issue of Reggie and Me or an issue of Bombshells. Like he's drawing it, he's but he's also not ripping off Frank Miller or trying to do Gene Colan or he's drawing Sandy but in the 70s, and I thought that was really fascinating to see him do that. And there's one page that I know he hated drawing because it was so hard to like draw something poorly, but there's a moment where a different creative team takes over the Lynx, and one of the excerpts is like the bad creative team like making it a very hokey over sexualized character, and he had to draw it in that kind of crappier style, and that was really fun to see and just to show. I got a lot of people who were not comic readers reading that and saying, oh, I didn't realize that other people take over the books and change the style and change the story. um And one of the more gratifying things is when mystery readers have read Secret Identity and they'll say to me, I was not a graphic novel reader, but I felt like this was a great introduction. So now I'm more into and more open to the medium, which I think is wonderful. And the inverse being like you bring in some comics people who come because they hear about the comic book murder mystery, and then you weave them into like the genre of mystery novels.
It's a nice that's how you get new readers.
Yeah, you hope. I mean, it wasn't like that plotted out. It was really just writing the book I wanted to read, but it benefited from that.
We were talking earlier about writing people outside of your purview, outside of your life range.
Yeah.
Like how what are the difficulties and challenges in writing somebody like Carmen, who obviously you're not a woman?
Yeah, I'm not a woman. I'm not a queer woman. We do have some overlap in that we both have that same Cuban American experience, but even that is not monolithic. Like, my experience is different from any other Cuban American. Like everything is unique. But I think as a writer, when you create a character, or when for me a character shows up, like Pete Fernandez just showed up. He walked in the door in my mind, and I was like, that's him. And the same thing happened to Carmen after I had that moment reading the David Hadju book. I knew who she was, and I knew what her kind of the broad strokes of the character were. So then, as a writer, the responsibility is yours to do the work. Do the research, make sure that while you're not trying to tell a definitive experience of this world that you're not familiar with, you're also respecting and honoring their experience. And so for me, that meant talking to authenticity readers, like people, queer women who had that experience, who could read the manuscript and say, yeah, this doesn't work, or this feels like a cliche, this is a trope. And that's, then being open to it and being open to changing the work and adapting to the notes and listening to people. But even at the end of the day, like the readers will decide if it's authentic or not, if they feel like it's a good story, or if they feel like the character is true to what you're trying to accomplish. But I think you have to be really transparent in that process, and you have to be really honest with how you're approaching it, which is hard.
How important is it to have an authenticity reader who'll just be completely straight with you? Like, would you even recommend like having an authenticity reader who's like your best friend?
I mean, your best friends could give the best notes. I think you just need to trust that the person is going to give you honest notes and not just say, like, not be your mom and be like, oh, that's great, just because you're giving it to them to look at. I think
So not your
uh,
mom.
not your mom. Yeah, don't have your mom as your like beta reader, because she'll just say it's great. But yes, you need honest feedback, and I think it's just part of being a creator. You need to be ready to take criticism and not take it personally. Like, once a book is out there, like reviewers are going to think what they're going to think, and I can't control that. You do the best you can. If it's like a beta reader, you still have time to change it. So I'm always happy to get feedback before the book comes out, because I can at least like improve on it.
Overall, what's the reception for the book been?
It's been amazing. Super
It's
positive.
super
I think
positive,
people
right?
were really, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I was blown away at the response. I think it's just been a life-changing thing.
Let's wrap this up by talking about some of your more recent and future projects.
Sure.
You wrote a story about Anya Corazon. What's it?
Yes.
What is the heart of this particular Spider Girl? Now that there are so many of them.
Yeah, there are so many spider heroes, and it's kind of cool. It's great. I mean, it's such a different world from when I was a big Spider-Man. Spider-Man was my guy as a kid. Um, But for me, it was really special because I vividly remember that moment in middle school, getting that copy of Spider-Man 2099 #1 and reading it and just being like, oh, okay, there's a Latinx. I mean, that term wasn't used back then, but Latino superhero as Spider-Man. And that felt really powerful to realize, not that I could be Spider-Man, but that, it wasn't just limited to Peter Parker, a character I love, but anyone could really tap into that and become a spider hero. Um,
Somebody like you
and
could be a main character.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. That sense of identification was really powerful. And I felt the same thing with Aranya, because her experience is very much like Peter Parker's. Her gaining of powers, her her demeanor, whereas Miguel is in many ways the opposite of Peter Parker. He's very glib and funny as Miguel, but then as Spider-Man he's very dark and brooding, whereas you have the inverse. Like Peter Parker is this very like nerdy, quiet kid, but then as Spider-Man he's jovial and funny and cracking jokes and just very extroverted. Um But what was interesting when I was talking to Marvel about doing the book, they wanted to do a Spider-Man centric novel. Um, and or well, actually, what I did is I listed characters and we went back and forth. And I realized that Aranya and Spider-Man 2099, though they'd interacted in a lot of these big Spider events, hadn't really had a moment together, like a big arc together. And I thought that the idea of like a young character learning from a mentor, but also a mentor learning from this new character that loved being a superhero was really interesting. So Miguel learns as much from Anya as she learns from him. And I'm most proud in that novel of the arc of their friendship. You know, they start at odds, and by the end of it, without spoiling anything, the dynamic has changed in a really meaningful way. And that character work was the fun part for me. Like, obviously, I loved like throwing in characters and, you know, playing in the Spider-Verse. That was neat. But also, like the character stuff, the interactions and the growth is really interesting as a writer.
How did you feel as a fan, both as a Spider-Man fan, and as a Hispanic person
Hmm.
watching Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse this year?
Oh, it's cool. It's great. I mean, I never, like we were talking about before, I never thought in a million years that Miguel O'Hara or Spidey 2099 would be basically the star of a huge major animated motion picture. So, you know, it's all gravy at this point.
Yeah, the
In many,
protagonist and the antagonist of
yes, exactly.
the most critically acclaimed animated
Yeah.
superhero movie ever, both have Hispanic
Hmm.
heritage. I thought that
Yeah.
was I was watching that and I was like, oh, we've come a long way.
It's pretty wild. I mean, there's always room to improve. There's definitely more to be done, but yeah, that was great.
And there's still a long way left to go, admittedly.
Yeah, 100%.
You're also about to write a Daredevil novel.
Yeah.
Talk to me
Yes.
about Matt Murdock.
Oh man, messy Matt Murdock. Like, you know, Spider-Man was always my guy, but you know, I always loved Daredevil's stories were always like so much darker and so much more flawed and messed up. The Daredevil I started reading as a kid was the Lee Weeks, DG Chichester stuff, like the Last Rites, which was very much a response to Born Again, which I had not read yet, but I was so enamored with the character and the idea of, you know, this lawyer, you know, the blind justice metaphor, like this idea of this lawyer who tries to stand by the law by day, but is breaking the law by night to kind of fix the problems he can't fix as a lawyer. I found really fascinating. And I think of all the characters in the Marvel universe, Daredevil is probably the most in tune with just the crime genre in the way like Black Ghost is a PI novel with superheroes. Um, Daredevil is a street level crime story, except he's in costume. And so,
And sometimes
you
there
know,
are ninjas.
yes, sometimes there are ninjas, sometimes there's, you know, there's organized crime. Like all his battles and struggles work best when they're grounded.
Yeah.
You know, you can see him like interact with Mephisto, and that's interesting. But for my money, the most interesting Daredevil stories are the ones that are feel like they could happen. Like he just happens to put on this red costume. And I mean, I love the Netflix series. I thought that was really well done. And so Marvel was putting together this lineup of crime writers, and they reached out and said, "Would you want to do a Daredevil novel?" And I, of course, said yes because I love Daredevil. But I can't really talk about the plot yet; it's so far down the line. But it's very much, it's very evocative of the Daredevil runs that I love. Like, so, you know, like obviously if you're talking about Daredevil, you have to pay some homage to Frank Miller, but you know, some more underrated runs like the Innocenti run, I think is fantastic.
Yeah.
I think Chichester's run is very underrated, especially the early part. Like everyone seems to talk about the Fall from Grace stuff, but for me, my favorite part is the Lee Weeks arc, which feels like very grounded and very noir, and very heartfelt. Like there's a lot of like character stuff. And I think Innocenti's arc is all the more impressive because Frank Miller basically ripped the character to pieces and then left, which was his plan, like to do Born Again and then leave Matt Murdock in shreds. But she picked it up and made it into something new, which I think still doesn't get the credit it deserves. And then obviously the
Yes.
the hot, you know, stuff like Brubaker and Bendis. I love their runs, and Chip's run, Chip Starsky's run
Yeah.
has been great. Just a treat. And I really loved the first issue of Saladin's run. I thought that was really cool too.
I think Daredevil has been consistently well written
Yeah.
throughout the years. I do agree with you about Anna Santi. I think she was ahead of her time.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I think introduced if you introduced Typhoid Mary now, like as proven by Chip Zdarsky, like she's a much bigger character.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, so you also worked on a comic featuring a public domain character, and I gotta ask about this because
Yes.
I spoke to Jamal Eigel about this last year,
Oh, good.
and it's a public domain character named Microface, and my
Mhm.
question is, why?
A very good question you have asked. So, Planet Money, which is the business kind of podcast for NPR, did a series on comic book IP. Basically, so what Planet Money does is they try to explore like arcane business stuff and boil it down so a casual listener can understand what's going on. And they wanted to do a series of episodes on the idea of superheroes and how they became this big billion-dollar industry. And the motif they used, or the kind of theme, was we're going to try and buy a hero from Marvel and DC. It's going to be, we're going to try and buy like one of the lesser heroes and make a movie. And they talked about buying one of the Great Lakes Avengers. I think it was Doorman. And I was quoted in that first episode in my role at Archie, where they basically said, why won't they sell us a character? And I said, you're one good story away from a multi-billion-dollar movie or success. So IP is important. It's of value. Um, and so then they off air, they said, well, what can we do if like Marvel or DC doesn't engage? And I said, well, you can always find a character in the public domain and create your own version of the character if you can't create someone like of whole, a completely new character. And so Kenny, one of the hosts, they found Microface, which is this old Golden Age character that was now in the public domain. And I think there's a panel of him like using his helmet where he's just saying tweet, like tweet, tweet. This is way before Twitter even existed. But his power is he can project his voice, he can alter his voice, he can send sonic blasts. Um, and they asked me, would you want to work on this? Like, if we make a comic of Microface, would you want to work on it? And I said 100%. I think it's really cool. Like, NPR is a great, I love NPR. I think it's a very unique idea. It kind of plays in that metafictional space that Secret Identity does, or things like that. And we managed to get Jamal to draw it, and Jamal is one of my favorite artists, one of my oldest friends in the industry, and just a great artist, a great
He's amazing.
storyteller. Yeah, just so good. Um, Ellie Wright was the colorist, Taylor Esposito did the letters, and Jerry Ordway redesigned the character. Jerry, who has a great track record as someone who's touched the Golden Age heroes, but also modernized them with like Infinity Inc. and the Justice Society
Mhm.
and so many other things. So he redesigned the character, and there's that great cover of him bursting through the old Microface comic. And then Jamal did the interiors and had his own variant cover. So yeah, that's how it came together. And then the rest of the series of episodes were the hosts chronicling the creation of the comic book. So I was interviewed, Jamal was interviewed, Jerry was interviewed, and just talking about like what the process of creating a comic book was like. And that was really wild. And I've never gotten so many calls from people saying, "Hey, I heard you on NPR talking about Microface." Um, I would love to revisit those characters. I think there's a chance that we could do more, but it's, like with anything else, it's finding the right fit, finding the time. But I'm really proud of that issue.
It's crazy to think that Microface might be the thing that got you the most calls.
Yeah, I mean, it's always, you never know what's gonna hit.
Let's wrap this up by plugging anything else you have. I know you interview people on crime reads.
Yeah,
You got a podcast, so
yeah, I'm just doing a
anything
bunch
else?
of stuff. So, Alter Ego, which is the follow-up to Secret Identity, hits next fall from Flatiron Books, and that is the other side of the coin. It's set in the modern day. It follows a film director named Annie Bustamante, who used to work in comics. She had a beloved run on an iconic character, left comics to pursue a career in film, but is lured back into comics when an obscure character she loved growing up is being rebooted by a new film company called Triumph Entertainment, and the character is the Legendary Lynx. And so there's this social media wave of fans pining for Annie to come and draw this comic. And so she agrees to do it. But as she starts that process, she starts digging deeper and deeper into the history of this character and starts finding out that, maybe the people that this company is promoting as the creators didn't create this character, and kind of grappling with the idea of like, if I work on this character, am I complicit in the bad behavior of this corporation? Like, And so it's a lot of that. It's fun. I'm excited to work on that, and it'll be out next year. Dark Space, a sci-fi novel I co-wrote with Rob Hart, the author of The Warehouse and Paradox Hotel, is coming out next year from Blackstone. Next month I have a Spider-Man story in Marvel Zombies, Black, oh yeah, Black, White, and Red and Blood, which is the Marvel anthologies. Where they're black and white except for a splash of red. And Javi Fernandez is the artist on that, and that was really fun. I have a short story in the second issue of Ahoy's Cryptid anthology with Steve Bryant, spotlighting a Miami supernatural occult detective named Diana Montalvan. And lately I've gotten to write stories with Sinestro, The Question. I did a really fun Polaris story, X-Men Infinity comic that was drawn by Alberto Albuquerque, which was really great. And some other stuff I can't announce. And we are doing a Lynx comic book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's going to be completely tongue in cheek. It is completely tongue in cheek. Like we're serializing it on Zest World, but what we're saying is that Sandy and I are remastering these lost pages from this 1970s comic book. We're serializing it on Zest World, but it's going to come out in print from Image early next year.
One more question, because you talked about the follow-up to Secret Identity,
Yeah.
Alter Ego.
Mhm.
When you're writing a crime story, a mystery, a noir story, okay, the 1970s, no cell phones, no internet.
Yeah.
Today, cell phones and internet. How much
Yeah.
does that change the dynamic of writing a story like this?
A lot. It makes it much harder to look. Nobody wants to read paragraphs about Annie scrolled through her phone and texted this person. Like it's hard. You have to try to find unique ways to make that interesting, and that's the challenge. But it's not impossible. So
Okay. And my last question is,
yeah.
fill in the blank. If you like blank, you should read Secret Identity.
Yeah, if you like Cavalier and Clay and if you like film noir, you will like Secret Identity.
Thank you, Alex.
All right, man. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much.